Okay, so the topic for tonight, actually, I got this in a discussion with Sherry Dukowski, who's the executive director of the Jewish Federation, and we were talking about good and evil and free will and free choice as understood in Judaism. And so we started talking about the subject that I'd like to focus on tonight, which is the Yetzer HaRah and the Yetzer Tov. Um, And you'll see from the articles, I have a couple of articles. I have a Safari sheet. I mean, it's actually pretty interesting. And I will just preface this by saying that I really think Judaism has it right here. I mean, there are many things I love about Judaism, and the question of evil and tragedy. Basically, the issue is if you have a good, powerful, loving, righteous God, how is it possible that rotten things happen in the world? And I don't know if any of you have been staying up on the news, but there's plenty of rotten things happening in the world. So the question is, how does Judaism understand that issue? And I always divide the subject into two subjects. The subject, by the way, has its own name in the world of theology, and it's called theodicy. And so theodicy gets split into two sections. One is evil, and the second is tragedy. And the distinction is human free will. Evil is something that people presumably have the ability to do or not to do, and they choose to do evil or choose not to do evil. That's one issue, which we're going to talk about tonight. And then the other one is tragedy. Tragedy, for purposes at least of this discussion, I think of as diseases, tsunamis, earthquakes, things that aren't the result specifically of human choice. So, Big Doggy, also known as Bryce. Maybe I shouldn't say Bryce. Sorry.
I don't care. That's okay. I'm just having a little fun with it. I just want to ask, what is the opinion? What is the opinion of Judaism, or your opinion? Is evil a concept or a thing?
Okay, so I think we're going to get into that. I would say briefly, evil is disobeying God's instructions as we find in Scripture. So that doesn't sound like a thing to me. And in Judaism, by and large, it doesn't get embodied in an anti-God like Satan. But we'll see in the text. I mean, I read these texts a while ago. I looked at them again today, but we'll see it in some detail. So I am going to go to share screen. Okay, and if anybody sees something unusual about the way things are showing up, let me know, because again, I'm experimenting with pinning myself to the video. Okay, so this is actually from a journal called the Jewish Exponent, Yetzer HaRah and Yetzer HaTov. Would someone like to begin reading Parshat Va'etchanan?
I could do it.
Thank you.
Parshat Va'etchanan. The terms id and superego became well known in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through the psychoanalytic work of Sigmund Freud. The concepts themselves fit neatly into a traditional Jewish view of the human psyche. The id, the part of the personality that is composed of instinctual drives, is considered to be present from birth. The superego, developed at a later stage of life, reflects the internalizing of moral rules inculcated by parents and teachers. The superego is intended to act like the conscience that keeps the id in check. In the rabbinic understanding of human nature, the Yetzer HaRah, the evil impulse, is analogous to the id, because it, too, is present from birth, and misdirected and unchecked results in antisocial behavior. Analogous to the superego is the Yetzer HaTov, the good impulse born at the age of 13, according to Avot de Rabbi Natan, chapter 16. It is the outcome of learning the moral rules of the Torah. Having internalized these rules of socially acceptable behavior, the conscious self can channel the urges of the Yetzer HaRah into constructive activities. Among these would be, the rabbi said, building a house, marrying and being faithful, begetting children and modeling for them a life of Torah study and good deeds, and conducting business affairs honestly. The point of connection between this view of human nature and Parshat Va'etchanan is the verse Deuteronomy 6:5. Va'ahavta et Adonai Elohekka.
Elohe, v'ahavta Adonai Elohecha b'chol lebavcha.
Yeah, well, okay. You shall love the eternal, your God, with all your heart. The word for your heart, lavavcha, is written with two bets instead of the usual one.
So I actually pulled this up. Can everybody see this?
Yes,
Safari?
I can.
Okay. So here's the phrase you just read. And what we have is, I realize when I display it on this screen, it's a little harder for me to control, but with all your heart is b'chol levavcha. Normal, simple Hebrew, and I have a good Hebrew speaker here. I can't see her on the screen now. Debbie, your heart
Yeah,
would be levcha. Is that
Libcha.
right? Livcha.
Libcha.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So there's an extra bet in there. So what we're going to see in this argument is, of course, what the rabbis will say, and you've heard me say this before, is that the way we determine the will of God and understand God is to read deeply, deeply, deeply into Torah. So the word your heart is spelled wrong. There's an extra bet in there. So we'll see what the text has to say with it. It's written with two bets instead of the usual one. So why don't you continue, Bryce?
The rabbis pondered the twinning of the letter bet and drew a lesson from it. At Mishnah Barakot 9:5, we read, one must bless God for the evil in the same way as one blesses for the good, with all your heart, lavavka, with your two impulses, the evil impulse as well as the good impulse. There are two chambers in the heart, so to speak, that have competing powers. Lavav, the less common spelling for lev, is a reference to Yetzer HaRah and Yetzer HaTov. How to find beneficial outlets for Yetzer HaRah is the task of Yetzer HaTov. Another verse in Torah, Genesis 2:7, was also interpreted to support the idea that human beings are created with contradictory forces pulling away from each other. Rav Nachman bar Hav Hizda expounded, why is the word Va'yitzer et ha'adam, God formed the human being, spelled with two yods? Because the Holy One created two Yetzers, impulses in the human being, the impulse to good and the impulse to evil. There are also two accounts in Genesis for the creation of human beings.
And I'm going to try and show this. And for some reason, in my doing this, I fouled with the, let's see if this works. Yeah, that's a little better. I think I can hopefully increase this. Yeah, so it says, let's see if I can see this. God formed the human. You see it in the English. And yeah, I'll do a serious blow up of this. So here it's Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam, and there's an extra yud. You don't need that yud according to the spelling rules of Hebrew. So again, the rabbis are going to say one yud is for the Yetzer HaTov, and the other yud is for the Yetzer HaRah.
Good question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Could you go back to that?
Sure.
When did little tiny magnifying glasses become vowels?
You're talking about these things?
Yeah.
So I should do a separate session on that. Those actually are not vowels. Those are actually called trope.
Cantillations.
Yeah, but cantillation implies singing, and indeed, when we study this, most people understand these as markers for how to sing. But the Masoretes to specifically answer your question, the Masoretes invented both the vowels and the cantillation about 1,000 years ago. And the cantillation also, those marks that are not vowels have grammatical value.
Okay.
And in some cases, the grammatical value is very important. You've all probably seen on Facebook, grammar, commas save lives. Let's eat, comma, children, or let's eat children. So it's actually knowing the grammatical value of those things is actually quite helpful in translating. And so, these are kind of connecting. That little comma and that little comma is connecting. Sometimes they're below. There's a little comma there. There's a little comma there. This little upside down looks like a wishbone actually is the end of a sentence. So there's a lot there. One of these days I'll do a session on that. It's very interesting, but I find everything very interesting. But very, very good question. But the point is that misspellings are not misspellings in Torah. These misspellings are kept, and the rabbis are going to interpret them to have deeper meaning. Okay.
I said the same thing to my English teacher. My misspellings are not misspellings.
Yeah, right. I am with you. Actually, one of the great things for me is with my smartphone here, I can dictate messages and things. And when I put on the Hebrew font, I can actually dictate in Hebrew. And believe me, my spelling in Hebrew is even worse than my spelling in English, and it just recognizes it. And I think it's fantastic. Okay, let's continue with Soloveitchik.
Thus, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the towering figure of modern orthodoxy, posited that there are two different qualities in human beings, which he called Adam 1 and Adam 2. This is how I understand Adam 1. He is brazen, focuses on satisfying his needs, and seeks to dominate others. I think of Adam 1 as the paradigm of Yetzer HaRah. By contrast, Adam 2 is a humble creature. He does not seek to exercise mastery according to his own desires, but wants to cultivate his moral virtues and to live harmoniously with his community. Adam 2 is the paradigm for Yetzer HaTov. Our lives are like a dance with our contradictory qualities. The dichotomy in human nature is also seen in an old Cherokee tale about life. Grandfather says to his grandson, "Boy, a fight is going on inside me. It is a terrible fight, and it is between two wolves. One is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego." He continued, "The other wolf is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too." The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked the grandfather, "Which wolf will win?" The grandfather simply replied, "The one you feed." It's a good story.
It's a great story, and I really do think it captures the concept of Yetzer HaRah and Yetzer Tov very well. Let's finish this article, and then we can discuss it a little bit.
The Babylonian sage Abaye altered the plain meaning of Ahavta. You shall love, and read it as Ve'ihavta, meaning making the verb into a causative form. You shall cause to be beloved. The lesson he drew was that the name of heaven should be loved on account of you. When one studies Torah, is honest in his business dealings, and speaks gently to people, God says about him, so to speak, "You are my servant by whom I am glorified." In other words, that person is acting on his good impulse, feeding his soul with love, humility, kindness, generosity, and compassion. Rabbi Fred V. Davidow, author of Guardians of the City, Stories for Shaping Moral Character, teaches in a number of venues in Metro Philadelphia. The Board of Rabbis of Greater Philadelphia is proud to provide the Torah commentary for the Jewish exponent.
Okay,
I guess we're done.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop stop sharing. I do want to look at the Wikipedia article on this because it adds a lot. So, how would you contrast Judaism's understanding of good and evil, Yetzer, HaRah, Yetzer Tov, with, I would say, maybe it's being unfair to you again, Jim, as always, with Christianity's understanding, or maybe even your own understanding? How does this nuance contrast with sort of what you think about good and evil, if it does?
Well, either belief shouldn't alter how I act. I should strive to not sin and to do good and to love, regardless of what is pulling me in either direction. So the study of this is kind of fun, and we like doing it, but it shouldn't have an effect on my life. And as you know, Christianity, we have the devil, and for 40 days Jesus was in the desert, and the devil tempted him, and Jesus talked to him. So kind of hard to get around that. What you're presenting sounds really, really logical and right too. Maybe the devil is. I don't know. Maybe that was written so that Christians would have a personality to put the Yetzer HaRov to. I don't know answers like that.
Okay.
But I'm still clinging to my Christian belief, but I'm wondering, what do you do with the serpent in Eden?
What do I do with the serpent? I trample it with my heel. But nowhere in Jewish text is the serpent associated with Satan or the devil or forces of evil.
So, he's not a Yetzer.
No.
So what does that mean then? What's the significance of that?
The significance of what?
Of the serpent. It's got to mean something.
Yeah, I think the serpent is a character in the story, as I love to point out, and I have it on my YouTube channel, which is public. It's the only character in the story that doesn't lie. Everything the serpent says is true. Everyone else lies or misleads. Yeah, it's a character in the story. But in Jewish tradition, it is not associated with Satan or the devil or even evil per se. Interestingly, in the Quran's version of Eden, there's no serpent, but there is Satan.
Interesting.
It's interesting.
Now, in an email, you and I have disagreed on whether the serpent lies or not, and Dennis Prager called him a major liar.
Yeah, I disagree with Dennis on that. Because literally everything the serpent says comes true. So, B.
Yeah, but he is misleading.
No, actually, everything he says comes true.
Well,
literally and
he said, "Didn't God tell you to not eat anything from the garden?" Well,
he asked a question.
That wasn't true.
Oh, he asked a question.
No, it was a disingenuous question, but I'll cede to you.
Okay. Actually, I think it's a question designed to encourage a dialogue, because this is off the subject. But the serpent could have said, "Did God tell you not to eat from that tree?" And then Chava, also known as Eve, would have said, "Yes, God told us that." End of discussion. Not an interesting story. But he actually draws Chava out into a discussion. So anyway, but yeah, we've talked about this before. B.
Okay.
Or Beth.
So an interesting thing to me about the two differences that I've experienced. within Judaism, I've noticed that there is not the shared idea that, again, like we've talked about with sin, right? It's missing the mark, as opposed to the Christian belief of you're just constantly battling this your sinful nature that wants to bring you down constantly, and you have got to, it's so powerful, and it's, that's why they say things like backslidden. You're sliding back into the your flesh. That's why they say things like
I got it.
and I haven't noticed that same outlook through Judaism. So, having the kind of the ego in the flesh, or the good and evil in all of us, it's almost like, yeah, it's there, but people are inherently good. Whereas,
Okay. So I really want to jump in on this, because you and I are reading Judaism differently. What I would say is the biggest difference I see in Judaism and Christianity is that sin is not tied to the Garden of Eden. Is that there's not a concept in Judaism of original sin, and therefore we are all sinners and need the salvific grace of God or Jesus or whatever in order to escape the role of sin. So
Sure.
You're right, Judaism describes sin as missing the mark. But what I would say in this text is, and this concept of Yetzer HaRah and Yetzer Tov, is there are two wolves battling inside of us. And it is easy to slide into sin. And you'll see actually from some of the other texts, sin gets a 13-year head start in a person. The Yetzer HaRah, I should say, rather than the Yetzer Tov, which is something I never realized till I read these articles. So I would say that there is a battle inside of us going back and forth, relating to sin. Yeah, I don't know what else to add, but it's not tied to the Garden of Eden. And it's not that we have a inherently sinful nature. We have a nature that embraces both Tov and Ra. And it's up to us to choose which way to go. Bryce.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I grew up as a Christian, and one of the overwhelming things I can remember growing up is this idea that Satan is always lurking outside you and is trying to do everything he can to get you can't, you think that it's God, but it's the devil. All right. And and so forth. And what's really interesting to me is, and one reason I consider Judaism anyway to be more welcoming than that, is that these two natures are within us. Christianity has outsourced evil and made it into a person, okay, and has made it into an opponent that is sleepless and is always waiting to get. I mean, it's paranoia, and so that's one of the reasons why I became an atheist at 10.
Yeah. So what I would say is Christianity personified it, and I would say it's sort of a poetic personification. The biggest difference for me in Christianity and Judaism's understanding here relates to the Garden of Eden and whether our souls are tainted by sin from the beginning, literally from Eden. And as I mention often, there's a prayer that we say, it's part of every morning's liturgy, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. Adonai, the soul you have given me, she is pure. And some scholars believe that was inserted by the rabbis early on in the Talmudic period as a very subtle way of distancing ourselves from the idea of original sin. But I see Satan as sort of a personification of the Yetzer HaRah. Okay, with that said, I am going to look at another article, more detailed, but actually pretty good. So we may not finish tonight, but that wouldn't be the first time. Okay, so this is from Wikipedia, and I'll Let's see. I'll read the first paragraph because there's a bunch of Hebrew there. In Judaism, Yetzer HaRah is the congenital inclination to do evil, violating the will of God. The term is drawn from the phrase, the imagination of the heart is evil, biblical Yetzer Lev Ha'adam Ra, which occurs twice at the beginning of the Torah. And you see the references there. And I guess the word congenital means it's an inherent part of us, and it doesn't go away. I mean, I'm not a doc here, so I don't know the literal definition of congenital, but I know congenital diseases are ones that you live with, and you're not necessarily hoping for a pill that will cure you. So it is
Genital
part,
means
it's
from the beginning.
yeah, part of our nature. Okay, would someone else like to read beginning here, the Hebrew word Yetzer?
I'll read if no one
Thank you,
wants.
Joanne.
Rabbi. The Hebrew word Yetzer, having appeared twice in Genesis, occurs again at the end of the Torah. I knew their devisings that they do. Thus, from beginning to end, the heart's Yetzer plan is continually bent on evil. However, the Torah, which began with blessing, anticipates future blessing, which will come as a result of God circumcising the heart in the latter days.
Yeah. Oh, it's funny. I can't see the footnotes, but I do have the footnotes at the bottom here. So so that reference at the end is in Deuteronomy 33. Anyway, you all have the article, and you can check the footnotes. Let's continue in traditional Judaism.
In traditional Judaism, the Yetzer HaRah is not a demonic force, but rather man's misuse of things the physical body needs to survive. Thus, the need for food becomes gluttony due to the Yetzer HaRah. The need for procreation becomes promiscuity, and so on. The Jewish concept of the Yetzer HaRah is similar to the Christian concept of a sin nature known as concupiscence, which is the tendency of humans to sin. However, concupiscence stems explicitly from original sin, while the Yetzer HaRah is a natural part of God's creation. According to the Talmudic tractate Avot de Rabbi Natan, a boy's evil inclination is greater than his good inclination until he turns 13, or mitzvah, at which point the good inclination is born and able to control his behavior. Moreover, the rabbis have stated, the greater the man, the greater his evil inclination.
Yeah, so this raises actually a couple of interesting points. This idea that the Yetzer HaRah is not a demonic force, but man's misuse of the physical body needs is an important one, and it relates to this concept of id. As you'll see in a later discussion, the rabbis are going to have a playful story about eliminating the Yetzer HaRah, and that is not a good thing. I mean, we might think, just sort of in our general parlance, eliminating sin would be a wonderful thing, but eliminating the id, and in the Hebrew version, the Yetzer HaRah, means no one has any desire to accumulate anything. Every living thing has lost its sexual urge, and if we lose our sexual urge completely, we're going to have a population problem. So the idea here, at least in this paragraph, is that it's it's pursuing these things to excess which cause the problem, but we actually need them. And then we're going to see this idea that a child before the age of bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah for women are not responsible for their sins. So the imagery here is that your impulse and actually legal requirement to obey mitzvot doesn't begin until about age 13, 12 for girls. So the rabbis are saying that's when we actually get the Yetzer Tov. Elmer.
Yeah. So then what that seems to me is saying that then, did this not exist before Adam and Eve ate from the fruit in the garden? And then once they ate from the fruit in the garden, then it started right there.
Oh, yeah. Judaism doesn't relate this to the Garden of Eden at all. And the key is that the text that we read which is in Genesis 2:8, is actually in the Garden of Eden, but it says God formed the human being, Yetzer, Adonai. And so this is before the fruit, before the tree is named, and we already have the two inclinations. So what Judaism is saying is this is not the result of original sin or the fall of man, or however you want to describe it in the Garden of Eden. This is essentially part of our nature.
So then maybe that act can be exactly what it says. It was about the tree of knowledge, so it was knowledge, and that's it.
Oh yeah, and again, and I talk about this in that discussion, which is online. Knowledge of good and evil is a phrase called a merism, which means it's an encompassing thing. It's like soup to nuts. So it's used in other places in the Bible to say knowledge of everything. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Okay, Joanne, if you're up to continuing reading, you please do
Okay.
so.
Free will and the choice between evil and good inclinations. The underlying principle in Jewish thought, states that each person, Jew and Gentile alike, is born with both a good and an evil inclination. Possessing an evil inclination is considered neither bad nor abnormal. The problem, however, arises when one makes a willful choice to cross over the line and seeks to gratify their evil inclination based on the prototypical models of right and wrong in the Hebrew Bible. This notion is succinctly worded in the Babylonian Talmud. Everything is determined by heaven, except one's fear of heaven, meaning everything in a person's life is predetermined by God, except that person's choice to be either righteous or wicked, which is left to their free will.
Yeah, so I want to emphasize, this is not what you have to believe in order to be a good Jew. This is the Talmud expressing an opinion, which is preserving free will, and not every Jew, and certainly not me. I don't believe everything in a person's life is predetermined by God. Doggy.
Yeah, so I was just going to echo your sentiment that this phrase itself makes no sense. That because everything in a person's life is determined by God, and that includes everybody's acts. And if your acts, an act is either, an act by itself is neither good nor evil, but it's a context.
Yeah,
It depends. So
I agree. There's a
there isn't
logical
any.
problem.
It raises a tremendous logical problem because in a self-referential sense, it argues against its own truth.
Yes, I agree. There's a logical problem there. And the other thing nobody picked up on, which is a really interesting one, and I don't think this article develops it. Let me just see what footnote 6 is. Can't resist. Oh, I have to look at the Talmud. That the greater the man, the greater the person, the greater his evil inclination. And I think the rabbis were being autobiographical. I think they were talking about they considered themselves great people, and they also had tremendous evil inclinations. And I think they were describing their lives as battling between the temptation to do good and the temptation to do evil. And and I guess I hadn't really thought this through, but if you're barely at the level of human existence and you're on the verge of starvation and barely surviving, the range of your possible sins is more limited than if you're living, the life of greatness, however you define that. But we do see that in rabbinic literature. It's not discussed here. It would be fun to actually track down some of those. There is a story in the Talmud. This will not please anybody, that says that if you find yourself overwhelmed by your evil inclination, and here I think the image is you find yourself overwhelmed by needing to go and visit a brothel. Okay, not a good thing. Go to a different town and dress in a disguise. So is literally not to destroy. My interpretation is you don't want to destroy your reputation. You don't want to destroy your ability to continue to do good in your own hometown, but it recognizes that you won't be able to always overcome your evil inclination. So it's a very interesting it's a very interesting story, and again, it's one of the things about Judaism that I admire, in that it deals, I would say, with real life rather than idealizations. Oh, maybe it is here, and I just didn't. Okay, yeah, we'll see what it says. Joanne, let's continue.
The Bible states that every person on some occasion succumbs to their evil inclination. For there is not a righteous man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. The Talmud speaks of the difficulty in overcoming the evil inclination. To what it is like, the evil inclination in man? It is like a father who takes his small son, bathes him, douses him with perfume, combs his hair, dresses him up in his finest accoutrements, feeds him, gives him drink, places a bag of money around his neck, and then goes off and puts his son at the front door of a brothel. What can the boy do that he not sin? In recognition of this difficulty, repentance, and in some cases affliction, is said to atone for most sins, while the preponderance of good works keeps one within the general class of good people. Maimonides gave instructions for how to view the evil inclination and ensuing hardships on that account. Therefore, let a man prepare his own mind and request from God that anything should ever happen to him in this world, whether of the things that are God's providence good, or of the things that are by him evil, that the reason for their occurrence is so that he might attain true happiness. Now, this was stated with regard to the good inclination in man, and with regard to his evil inclination. That is to say, that he might lay to his heart the love of God and his continued faith in him, even at an hour of rebellion, of wrath, or of displeasure, seeing that all of this revolves around man's evil inclination, just as they have said. In all your ways acknowledge him, meaning even in a matter involving transgression.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure what to make of this, except the idea that you seek to make the best out of bad things that happen in your lives.
Moshe Chaim Luzzatto.
That doesn't require a great brilliant person to say that. Do your best.
Yeah, but it is struggling, as Maimonides is struggling. Let's see what number 14 is. It's a commentary to the Mishnah. It is struggling, as Maimonides is struggling, to how, the existence of the Yetzer HaRah, if God is all good, how do we deal with that? So, and Rambam, is a philosopher struggling with this concept philosophically.
Moshe Chaim Luzzatto wrote in Derech Hashem that man is the creature created for the purpose of being drawn close to God. He is placed between perfection and deficiency, with the power to earn perfection. Man must earn this perfection, however, through his own free will. Man's inclinations are therefore balanced between good, Yetzer HaTov, and evil, Yetzer HaRah, and he is not compelled toward either of them. He has the power of choice and is able to choose either side knowingly and willingly. The power within man to overcome sin. While God created mankind with both good and evil inclinations, the two powers or tendencies that pull one in opposite directions, God commands each person to choose the good and right path over the evil. In the narrative of Cain and Abel, God tells Cain, "Isn't it true that if you do good, you shall be forgiven? However, if you will not do good, it is because sin crouches at the entrance of your heart, and to you shall be its longing, although you have the ability to subdue it."
I'll just stop for a second. This is the first time the word sin appears in the Hebrew Bible. We have this whole discussion in the Garden of Eden, and never once in the Garden of Eden is the word sin mentioned, and as also never once in the Hebrew Bible do they refer to what happened in the Garden of Eden as a sin. And even the prophets who rant and rail against sin never go back to Eden to point out an example of sin. It's Cain, when he murders Abel, that's the first mention of sin. I think we are here.
Medieval?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Medieval commentator Rashi explains, and to you shall be its longing, meaning the longing of sin, i.e., the evil inclination, which constantly longs and lusts to cause one to stumble, although you have the ability to subdue it, meaning if a person wishes, they will overpower it. The implication is that each person is capable of overcoming sin if they really wish to do so. This may or may not be difficult and may require some reconditioning, but it is still possible. Although there are many vices, the sages of Israel said that most people are drawn to stealing what does not belong to them, while fewer people are inclined to uncover the nakedness of others, a euphemism for lechery. On lust, Shalom Shabazi calls it a phenomenon of the soul and lays out ways in which a person tempted by lust can overcome the urge without being swept into its clutches. Positive role of the evil inclination. However, rabbinic sources also describe the Yetzer HaRah, when properly channeled, as necessary for the continuation of society, as sexual lust motivates the formation of families and greed motivates work. Rabbi Nachum bar Samuel bar Nachum said, in the name of Rabbi Samuel bar Nachum, and behold, it was very good. This refers to the Yetzer HaRah. But is the Yetzer HaRah indeed very good? Were it not for the Yetzer HaRah, a man would not build a home or marry a woman or have children or engage in business.
So again, I'll just point out what they're talking about here is on the first 6 days of creation, God looks at things and says some things are says quite often things are good. And behold, God did this and God saw that it was good. It's only on the 6th day after humans are created that God says it was very good. And this is a rather unusual interpretation, and I would say one that's kind of at odds, that humans being very good means they have both a Yetzer Tov and a Yetzer HaRah. Doggy.
I just want to say that this greed motivates work really sticks in my craw because I think what motivates work is the desire to keep eating.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think that's part of what, I'm sorry that Cheryl isn't here. I think that's part of what psychologists would call the id, because it is a basic need. And as opposed to, altruism, which isn't a need at that same level. And what I mentioned earlier in the article is that if that urge to eat gets out of hand or is overly fed or stressed, then it becomes gluttony and it becomes hoarding. Jim.
Yeah, something Bryce, sorry, Poggy mentioned. Back when I was teaching young kids, they thought that the idea of living in heaven where there's no sin would be boring. And that sounds like what this is. Well, nobody will want to have sex and have children because without their bad inclination, as if the sex is always a bad thing. So what I would do is I'd start naming off sins like murder and stealing and such, and how would life be without those? Then they sort of figured out that, well, maybe it'd be better without those. So this is kind of going back to I think their sort of elementary view of everything's going to be boring if there's not sin.
Yeah, so what I would say about the Garden of Eden, what I think is born in the Garden of Eden is the distinction of humans, adults from children, and humans from animals. And I point to this idea of nakedness. Before they eat the fruit, the text says they were naked, but they were not ashamed. So who are naked but not ashamed? Basically, babies and animals. So I think free will and choice are born, and without free will, if we, one of the ways I like to paint this is, suppose Adam and Eve and every other human since always obeyed God. I think that would be a boring life. Maybe I personalize this too much. Suppose I told my children, I'm going to support you till the day you die. And of course, you will obey everything I tell you to do, from what you eat to the music you like to the friends you're going to have. And you never really have any independent free will. So I think the essence of humanity is free will. And yeah, it would be, in Eden, if there was never anything to strive for because we'd have everything, there'd be nothing to work for. There'd be nothing to lose, presumably no death. There'd be no sadness. I agree with your students. I think it would be a very boring world.
But
yeah,
there was still work in Eden before the forbidden fruit was eaten. Adam was told to tend to the garden. They had work to do there.
Yeah, but it wasn't hard work.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so anyway, but reasonable people can read that story differently. But I personally agree with your students. B.
So did God make us out of boredom?
Did God make us out of boredom?
Yeah, and give us this free will, right? Because if God existed and possibly angels or whatever else, we all agreed that without sin it would just be a little bit boring. So is this just, this kind of God is bored experiment? Let them choose what they want and see what happens?
So I would answer your question in a different way. What I would say is that when the text says we are created in the divine image, and the text actually has an interesting way of saying it. It's God says, God says, let us make humanity in our image. So I read that as saying we are both in the image of animals and in the image of God. So let's think about the life of animals. Here's a question for you. I mean, it's a very interesting question. Do you think, by human standards, animal life is boring? I would say there are very few living things that have as good a life as the two cats that live with us. But I would say it's astoundingly and astonishingly boring. Their lives, every one of their days are virtually identical. They get up at the same time when they wake us up. They eat the same food. They nap most of the day. And, I can tell you that sounds good for about a day. And, and animals in the wild, I mean, they hunt and they're killed but is that a life you would want to live? Literally a life of an animal where you couldn't conceive of what am I planning to do? How am I trying to make the life of my children better? How can I increase my understanding of the world? I would say that is an animal existence. And I would say that when we're created in the divine image, that means we're created to be able to contemplate various futures and make choices and ethical choices about those futures. And we get this big brain because we've tasted of the fruit of knowledge. And therefore we contemplate not only where is my next, wolf or I don't know, goat coming from that I can eat, but I can contemplate things like music and physics and mathematics and poetry and astronomy. And that to me, is what makes life interesting. I think through Disney movies, we can sort of fantasize and I idealize the life of animals, but I suspect that by human standards, animals' lives are pretty boring. I mean, they may be terrifying. So boring is not exactly the right word. I don't know. Yes, Cindy.
So the discussion about animals and the Garden of Eden has a nice intersection, because from an evolutionary psychiatry perspective, as well as depth psychology, what happened in the Garden of Eden is the differentiation of our hemispheres. So we're the only animals with two different hemispheres. Every other animal has two right brains, and we got a left brain, which is different and allows us consciousness of good and evil. So it may be that the Garden of Eden is really telling us about our awareness of evil inclinations.
Yeah, and you even see that, and I encourage you to, go to my YouTube channel and in the discussion of Eden. In the consequences of sin, the same word itzavon is used for both the man and the woman. For the man, that word itzavon is usually translated as you'll earn your bread through hard labor. And for the woman, the word itzavon is generally translated as labor pains. You will give birth in pain. But then in a very tantalizing reference, which is an easy one for me to remember, it's Genesis 6:6. And Jim, you will understand why that's easy to remember. There's a reference that just before the flood, it says, God saw how evil humans have turned out, and it pained God to see this, and God regretted having made humankind. And the word where it says it pained God in his heart is also itzavon. So itzavon is a regret in this translation, and this is Harold Kushner's writing, of seeing your offspring turn out to be something other than what you had hoped for, and understanding that in human life, there are lots of trade-offs with how you parent, and it's not always going to work so well, not for moms, not for dads, and not for God, but probably animals don't agonize. Probably the cat living in the field, once it gives birth to its kittens and the kittens are weaned, that cat is probably not worrying about whether its kittens are going to grow up to be socially responsible. Will they get good jobs? Will they marry nice, other kittens? Will I get grand kittens that will come and visit me? These are futures that are very human, but I would guess for the most part, absent in animals. Now, we've bred animals like dogs to be wonderful companions, and I don't want to minimize that at all. And I would say we've even bred dogs to have human-like qualities, which is fascinating. And an interesting question, again, I guess for biologists, is that natural, or is it the result of breeding? But I would say that that's one of the things that really is going on in the Garden of Eden and eating of that fruit, is that we are becoming adult rather than infants, and we are becoming human rather than animals. And I don't have enough biology to understand the difference between the hemispheres, of the brain. But there's a discussion every now and again. You see this, and I'm fascinated by the question: what makes humans different from animals? And, there was a time when people would say it's speech, but then we realized you can teach, even chimpanzees sign language, and they can have a pretty good vocabulary. So it's probably, and, whales have speech, and porpoises and other animals have speech. The one that convinces me, at least until someone comes along with a better idea, is the idea that what is distinctly human is to contemplate different paths of my action in the future and then selecting one. Am I going to study for this test, or am I going to goof off? Am I going to, I'm a married guy, am I going to suppress my Yetzer HaRah and the biology that's having me lust after these beautiful women in order to improve my home family life? Or am I not? I can contemplate different futures and select one. I think that's human. And I think that's what distinguishes humans from animals. I think that's what's going on in the Garden of Eden. But I'm willing to hear more knowledgeable thinking than mine. You know what? Look, I think we have one more paragraph two,
Yeah,
two more paragraphs. Personification of evil. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and yeah. So let's finish, and then I can do a little more next week.
Personification of evil. Although certain ancient groups of Jews appear to have believed in the existence of supernatural evil, in particular fallen angels, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Yetzer HaRah is non-apocryphal sources is presented as a personification of evil distinct from the supernatural devil of traditional Christianity and Islam. This tendency to
Demythologize.
demythologize Satan is found in the Babylonian Talmud and other rabbinical works, e.g., Resh Lakish said, Satan, the evil inclination, and the angel of death are all one. Notably, however, this and other passages of the Talmud do not deny the external existence of Satan, but create a synthesis between external and internal forces of evil. Similar tendencies can also be found in some Enlightenment Christian writers, such as the religious writings of Isaac Newton. Countering the effects of Yetzer HaRah, many of the enactments made by the rabbis throughout the centuries are actual safeguards to distance a person from their natural inclination and make it harder for them to sin. David's prohibition against yichud, the decree which forbids a man to be secluded in a room with a woman unrelated to him, and the rules outlining the conduct of Jews, which when entering a public bathhouse, are just a few examples.
Yeah, yichud is an interesting one. In a Jewish wedding, there is a ceremony at the very end of the wedding, in a traditional Jewish wedding, where the bride and groom are secluded in a small room for 10 to 15 minutes. And that's called yichud. It comes from the same root as the word echad, meaning one. And of course, what's going on here is, I always say, I would say always to Chuckles, that speaking to the couple, if you were a traditional Jewish couple, you would never be alone together without a chaperone. And again, if you go to Israel and you see, I'm going to stop this sharing. If you go to Israel and you see couples dating in the Orthodox world, they meet in a bar or they meet in a park, but always in a public place, and are never alone. And I've actually had people, recently tell me that 50 years ago when they got married, the rabbi shuttled them into this little room, and 10 minutes later they were brought out, and no one ever told them what was going on. And the answer is, in Jewish law, living together is one way of creating a common law marriage. There are certain Jewish legal authorities that say, if eligible Jews, if an unmarried Jewish man lives with an unmarried Jewish woman, and this is not sneaking around to Motel 6, but actually living together publicly, that by some legal authorities, they would be considered to be married. And if they didn't go on to have a wedding, they would actually need a divorce, in Judaism called a get, to separate. So in Judaism, there's a couple of different ways that a marriage is created, and in a modern Jewish wedding, we do all three. There's an exchange of rings, there's the signing of the ketubah, there's 7 blessings, and then there is this tradition of yichud. In modern weddings, which I conduct all the time, the decision to whether to pursue this yichud is generally made by the photographer, who really is the ultimate authority at weddings these days, in case you didn't realize this. Jim.
Could you explain, in the paragraph before the last, it said the fallen angel as in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so I'm not let's see, 23,
there it is, second
24,
line.
25. Yeah. Let's see. So there's the article. You can look it up. Jim, Dorothy Peters, Noah Traditions in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I can't explain it, but my informed guess is that this idea of Satan, a supernatural evil, or fallen angels, is mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not considered canonized. They're not part of the Hebrew Bible, but they certainly reflect the beliefs of a group which were probably the Essenes, ultra-religious purists living in the desert. And there are texts which talk about the war, the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. So it seems like, my knowledge of Dead Sea Scrolls is pretty surface, but there certainly was a discussion in the scrolls of this idea of the forces of evil and the forces of light, which starts sounding a lot like what we see in Christianity. And by the way, in Talmudic Judaism, Satan has a greater role. But you don't hear, as again, some of us and Bryce was talking about this, hear this idea that Satan is tempting you, and the famous Flip Wilson, a line that the devil made me do this. You don't hear that in Judaism, in normative Judaism at all. But what you do hear about, and we'll continue this discussion next week. There's some really interesting quotes from the Talmud about this story, which I love, where the rabbis trap. So this is the cliffhanger for next week. There's stories in the Talmud that the rabbis trap the Yetzer HaRah and put it in a cage where it can't do anything. So the question is, tune in next week to find out what happens in a world without the Yetzer HaRah. And so that's that's kind of an interesting story. Okay, we're a little past Big Doggy. Yes.
Yeah, just I realize it's a story and it's designed to be illustrative and funny, but the story itself contradicts completely the entire idea behind in Judaism that the Yetzer HaRah is internal, and each one of us has it.
Yes.
So
yes.
It's
It's poetry. It's
all right.
It's not meant to be taken literally, but the point of the story, as you'll see, is the Yetzer HaRah is necessary for human existence, and the way they illustrate it is through that story. Yeah, you I would say in general, you can't take these stories literally. Chris.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what you thought about the verse actually right before what you mentioned in Genesis 6:6 and 6:5, where God says that the intentions of man are evil, only evil, always.
Yes.
That seems to be completely counter to what you actually see play out with the patriarchs and really the rest of the Bible and this whole discussion. So I'm curious, why is it phrased that way?
Yeah, let me see if I can easily pop it up. Okay, yeah, so I would say, you can see it, right?
Yeah.
So it says in 6:5, again, this is, there's crazier stuff going on here. And if you take these stories literally, it's going to make you crazy. So going back to 6:4, let me make this a little smaller. Yeah, it says it was then that the Nephilim appeared on earth, when divine beings, Elohim, B'nai Elohim, which can be angels, which can be, you figure it out, it's the children of God, cohabited with human women, Benot HaAdam, who bore them offspring. Such were the heroes, old men of renown. And Adonai saw how great was human wickedness on earth, how every plan devised by the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. And Adonai regretted having made humankind on earth with a sorrowful heart. Yeah, I would bicker with that translation, but the Hebrew is very powerful. Yinachem, which means to regret that he had made Adam, humanity, on earth, ba'aretz. V'yit atzev, there's that word itzav or etzavon, and it pained him in his heart. So again, I would take these stories poetically. If you start trying to read the stories literally, you are going to be okay as long as you stick in the Orthodox world and read Orthodox commentaries. That is not my world. My world is I would say this is poetic excess, and there can be no greater poetic excess that God then proceeds, next text, I will blot out from the earth humankind whom I created, together with the beasts, creeping things, and birds of the sky, for I regret I made them. Ki nichamti ki asitem. I think God is way overreacting. And I don't take it literally for a moment. I think it's an interesting story, but I think the story just, it doesn't make sense to me. You know, if you ask the traditional commentator, so here's a question, see if anybody can guess this. What did the bunnies do?
Procreate.
They procreated. Is that a sin? Why did God destroy the bunnies? Here's a question for you. Why?
He
Yeah,
didn't.
in the flood. Saved 2 of them. But why did God kill off all the other bunnies except for 2? Or maybe 7?
Too much of Yetzer HaRah.
I'm sorry?
Too much of Yetzer HaRah.
In the bunnies.
Yes.
So I'll give you the traditional answer. The answer was cross-species intercourse. They were screwing around, literally. Do I believe this? No, not for a minute. I think this is a story of excess. I think this is a parable about God trying to speak to all humanity at once and getting God's message across to everyone, and then changing strategy in that God then starts to work through Abraham's family. But I don't take these stories literally at all. If I took them literally, I would be an Orthodox rabbi, and then I would be, Chris, I'd be answering you according to the traditional rabbinic commentaries. But, you know, as it says in that ancient text, it ain't me, babe. Doggy.
Yeah, so a couple of questions. One is that how do the Orthodox rabbis explain the Nephilim?
I don't remember. I think there are strange characters in the early biblical stories, and there are articles about it. You can Google it. It quite frankly, you know, I've looked at them and decided, should we discuss them? But I just think it gives too much credence to that. I'm not that interested in that question. I think
Okay.
these are fanciful creatures. There's also, you know, the
donkey that talks.
well, I mean, there's that, but the Leviathan and other creatures, you know, it's but I don't remember how the rabbis deal with it. But I have no doubt, I am absolutely certain that they deal with it in a way that they would understand as satisfactory. I don't think they would just throw their hands up and say, I'm not going to deal with this.
I'm sure they have an explanation.
Yeah, and the
wonder what it
Nephilim, you know, we
possibly
get
be.
into the Hebrew. The Nephilim may well come from the root word to fall, so maybe it was fallen ones. But I just don't remember what the commentary is. Nafal means to fall. You know, as you know, we talk about fallen angels and things, but I don't remember. Okay,
Yeah,
let's see. There was one thing in chat. Thank you. So I'm going to stop recording. Let's see, how do I do that? Let me stop sharing and stop.